I stood in the doorway of my mother's dining room, the air thick with something I couldn't yet name. Every face at the table turned toward me, my mother's calculated smile, my stepfather's cool glance, my siblings' restless eyes, and then the two men in tailored suits who I'd never seen before. "Remember," my mother said, her voice soft but laced with steel, "meet our lawyers." I was 32, but in that moment I felt the same quiet bracing I had as a teenager in this house, the stillness before a slap you knew was coming. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I simply asked why I'd been summoned. My mother gestured for one of the men to speak, but her expression told me this wasn't a conversation. This was a verdict. Only hours earlier, I'd been going through a box of my grandfather's papers, letters and receipts I'd kept in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed since his funeral. It had been a way of keeping him close, of reminding myself that there had once been one person in this family who saw me clearly. That morning, a folded sheet had slipped from between two envelopes. At first I thought it was just a note in his looping script, but then I saw the columns of numbers, the unfamiliar bank name, and a single line in his careful hand, "For when the time comes, you'll know." Now, standing in that room under the weight of so many eyes, I understood the urgency in his words. I suppose I should explain. My grandfather Harold was not just a man to me, he was the definition of integrity. The summer I turned 10, when my mother blew half of what was meant for our mortgage on a spree at luxury boutiques, it was Harold who quietly paid the bank to keep the house. He never once shamed her for it, but later, while we shelved stock together in his hardware store, he said, "You take care of what you've built, Chloe. Never let anyone spend it to feed their vanity." My mother never forgave him for that, not the money, but the way he invested in me instead of her. She chased status, he chased purpose. He taught me how to balance a ledger before I learned how to drive. We'd walk the aisles of his stores, him nodding to each employee by name, slipping me quiet lessons about trust and foresight. The rest of the family didn't understand our bond. Or maybe they did, and that's why they resented it. By the time I was 25, I knew enough about their habits, the overdrafts, the forgotten debts, the endless appetites, to see exactly why Harold kept his affairs private. When he died, the reading of the will felt like a small storm. My mother's face froze when the lawyer announced that Harold had left me not only his share of the family business, but several accounts for Chloe's sole discretion. She didn't fight it then, not openly. But I've lived long enough to know that some battles don't happen in daylight. Which brings me back to that room. The men in suits shifted their briefcases onto the table, and one began to slide a folder toward me. "We're here to discuss a reallocation of assets," he said, as if reading from a script. I didn't touch the folder. From the corner of my eye, I could see my mother's hands clasped in front of her, her rings flashing in the light. My siblings wouldn't meet my gaze. I had the sudden, sharp awareness that I was not invited here to speak, only to sign. And yet, in my jacket pocket, that folded paper from Harold's box felt like a stone in my palm. The numbers. The bank name. The implication that he'd left me something no one else knew about. It struck me then, maybe the fight they were bringing to my door wasn't the real one. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross my mother's face. What they didn't know yet was that I'd already started looking into Harold's code. And if my hunch was right, those numbers might change the balance of power entirely. Fear is loud, resolve is quiet. I chose quiet. The man with the folder began reviewing words he didn't own, and my mother watched me the way a cat studies a closed door. I let them talk long enough to reveal their shape: a petition to harmonize assets, an interim management agreement, a temporary transfer for efficiency. All of it was a way of saying, "Give us the keys, and be a good daughter." They were careful not to say my name. It's easier to bully an outline than a person. Pressure works best when you accept the room's terms. I declined. I asked for copies. I asked to review. I thanked them for their time. Polite refusals are knives wrapped in velvet, they cut without satisfying anyone's craving for a scene. When I stood to leave, my mother's smile shifted, not broken, just tauter, a thread pulled too tight. On the porch, the air was colder than it should have been for the hour. I kept my hand in my pocket around the folded paper until I reached my car. The code calmed me. Numbers don't flatter. They don't conspire. They either lead somewhere or they don't. At home, I cleared the kitchen table and laid out the page. 2 columns of digits, broken into uneven groups, 12, 4, 8, 7, then longer strings that looked like dates if you removed every third number, then a bank name that wasn't quite a bank name, a letter off, a deliberate misspelling, as if to conceal in plain sight. I turned the paper sideways. I held it against the window and traced the watermarks. Harold had shown me once how to hide instruction inside routine, how you can tuck a shopping list inside a ledger if you know which lines to read. For when the time comes, you'll know. I knew what he meant. He'd tailored the cipher to the two of us, to rhythms we shared. He'd taught me double-entry bookkeeping when I was 14 by having me reconcile the petty cash against coffee receipts because he knew I remembered small absurdities. He'd laugh when I noticed patterns others didn't, the employee who always bought the same brand of gum, the supplier who consistently rounded up by 7 cents. He trusted my eye. It was the one inheritance nobody at that dining table could file a claim against. The texts began just after dusk. From my mother, you embarrassed me today. We'll discuss consequences. From my stepfather, be reasonable. This is bigger than you. From my brother, a shrug emoji, then they're going to freeze you out if you keep this up. The last one, from an unknown number, carried no punctuation. You should sign. I didn't respond. Their words sat on the screen like a damp cloth, spreading cold into a room that had been warm a moment earlier. Pressure comes in waves, a strategy of fatigue. Wear someone down and they'll choose relief over truth. I set my phone face down and returned to the numbers. The bank name, misspelled, an extra E tucked near the end. Not a bank at all if you read the letters vertically, it spelled a street we used to walk from the store to the bakery where Harold liked the cinnamon rolls. The numbers beside it weren't an account, they were a date, the week he'd taught me to count inventory in reverse because a vendor had been skimming. The grouping below corresponded to ISBN check digits, his private joke because he used to pretend the hardware store was a library of useful objects. Cross-referenced that way, the first line yielded a sentence, start with the watch. His watch had been in my closet since the day we emptied his dresser. Stainless steel, worn smooth along one edge where his thumb would check the time before unlocking the store in the mornings. I retrieved the box from the top shelf, set it on the table, and lifted out the weight of an object that knows it outlasted a body. The back plate had a hairline seam I'd never noticed. I pressed my nail to it. It gave, then lifted with a satisfying click. Inside lay a thin brass disc, smaller than a quarter, stamped with a number that matched the third line of the paper, and a key silhouette etched along the rim. Not a key itself. A suggestion of one. A reminder. Safety deposit, not at the misspelled bank, but at the institution on the parallel street. He had hidden direction inside misdirection, the kind of small decency you build when you have loved someone in a house where decency is expensive. I went to the bank the next morning because waiting would only feed their narrative that I was indecisive. I wore a navy dress and low heels and carried a folder with copies of the will and my ID as if this were merely a practical errand. Inside, the lobby was quiet. The manager on duty introduced herself as Erin. Her eyes moved between the documents and my face, and I watched the measured calm of a person trained to match her expression to whatever she's told. I placed the brass disc on the desk. She studied it, then requested a moment. When she returned, she carried a gray ledger older than both of us and a small wooden box. The ledger held names written by hand in ink that had browned with time. The box held forms, nothing dramatic, no ceremonial key turning, just the ordinariness of legal secrets. Erin explained that the access required 2 things, my ID and a phrase. Not a password, she said, older than that. A phrase recorded by the depositor, to be spoken in the visiting room. I didn't know I knew it until it was already formed in my mouth. You take care of what you've built, I said, the way he had the first time I balanced the register without losing a single dime. Erin's face changed almost imperceptibly, relief maybe, or respect at a procedure followed to the letter. She led me to a small interior room with a metal table and walls thick enough to silence thought. She set down a long, narrow box, turned her half of the key, and left. Inside was not cash. It was so much heavier than that. Deeds photocopied against their originals. A list of shares in the parent company of the stores, not the shares everyone knew about but the class of stock most people assume doesn't exist because it never appears on the family bulletins. A letter in Harold's hand, short, not sentimental, like him when something mattered. He wrote that he'd watched for years as I practiced saying no without cruelty, and that he trusted that the strength to hold a line would outlast the need to be liked. He wrote that he'd split what others believed was whole, that the visible pot everyone salivated over was only half the story. The rest was meant to be a spine, not a trophy. He wrote that if I ever felt unsafe, I should take the blue envelope beneath the documents to a person named L. Park, who would know what to do. I knew the name. Lydia had handled probate filings with minimal conversation, a woman who preferred accuracy over charm. She was the kind of person who notices which pen you use. I'd respected her from the first meeting precisely because she wasn't my mother's kind of ally, she wasn't for sale. When I left the bank, the morning had become wind. My phone trembled with fresh messages, my mother again, then my stepfather, the cadence of their impatience gaining speed. I walked 2 blocks before opening any of them because reading in motion forces your body to remind you that it's still yours. My mother's text had shifted tone, we need to present a unified front. Sign now and we'll keep you in a leadership role. My stepfather's note was longer, folk conciliatory, invoking Harold's legacy of family, the phrase always dragged out when someone wants to wrap injury in good intentions. Then a new number again, bank visits leave footprints. I called Lydia from the sidewalk. She picked up on the second ring, her voice as precise as I remembered. She said, "Can you speak freely?" I replied, "Yes. For now." I didn't tell her everything, only enough to let her know the kind of threat I suspected and the fact of the deposit. She didn't ask leading questions. She asked for copies. She asked for the timestamp of my bank visit. She asked whether anyone in my family had access to my email or phone accounts. Then she gave me 3 instructions: change my passwords from a hardwired connection at her office, forward nothing by email, and photograph every document with metadata preserved. People who prefer performances over facts get tired when you refuse to perform, she said in her flat way before ending the call. It felt like a blessing spoken in a language most people never learn. When I reached my car, I saw the envelope under my windshield wiper, no stamp, no handwriting. Inside was a single printed page from a legal website, highlighting the steps required to challenge a will on grounds of undue influence, with a sticky note that read, "You won't like discovery." The handwriting was my mother's, slanted and neat, the loops of her Y elegant, as if civility could disguise threat. Fear did what it always does, expanded in the chest, then receded when I named it. Discovery had never frightened me. Secrets did. I drove to Lydia's office without going home first. The building was brick, old, with a brass directory and a hallway that smelled faintly of dust and citrus cleaner. Lydia ushered me into a conference room with frosted glass and a view of the river that didn't invite conversation. We worked in silence for a while, scanning, photographing, labeling files with dull names that would bore anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She read Harold's letter twice, then placed it back in its envelope as if returning a fragile bone to a body. 2 fronts, she said. What they think is battlefield and what actually is. I understood. I left her with copies and took only what I needed to move my plan forward. On my way out, she stopped me with a practical caution: keep the watch on my person, not at home, not at the office. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The weight was reassuring. That night, the pressure escalated. My mother called 3 times in a row, unusual for her because she hates to look as if she's pursuing anything. I let it go to voicemail. She texted instead, switching tactics: "I'm worried about you. You've been so distant. This anger isn't like you." The weaponized worry, the invented anger, the rebranding of my boundaries as a mood. Years ago, I might have answered to protect her from the emptiness that follows accountability. I turned the phone over again and returned to the table. The moral temptation arrived in the form of a simple idea. Harold's documents gave me the capacity to cut off access to the visible accounts with one notarized action and 2 signatures Lydia could obtain by morning. I could end the fight before it began. Freeze, reassign, move. It would be legal. It would also starve the payroll at the stores if I timed it poorly. People who had shown up every day for years, people Harold had greeted by name, would carry the immediate cost of my clean victory. I traced the edges of the brass disc with my thumb and let the thought pass through me without taking root. I wouldn't win like that. He wouldn't have either. Instead, I drafted a slower plan that protected the business first and then me, shift the silent shares into a trust with operational safeguards, move the dividends into a separate account with Lydia as co-trustee, leave the surface undisturbed long enough to stop any emergency meeting they might try to call under the pretext of stabilizing things I hadn't destabilized. It meant absorbing more of their pressure in the short term, but it also meant that when I finally said no, I could say it without collateral I'd regret. Close to midnight, headlights swept across my living room wall and lingered. I stood very still and listened. A car door, then another. Voices lowered the way people speak when they want to sound reasonable through wood. A knock at my door that wasn't loud, just insistent. He said, "Chloe? It's late. We just want to talk." I recognized my stepfather's cadence. My mother didn't knock, she arrived. I didn't move toward the door. I gathered the documents into their folders and slid them into the false bottom of the file cabinet I'd bought back when my life required hiding nothing. I placed Harold's watch in my pocket. I turned off the lamp. The knock came again. Softer. A key slid against the lock and met resistance. I had changed it last month without telling anyone, one boundary I set without fanfare, perhaps because some part of me had known this scene was inevitable. Footsteps retreated. Murmurs. A car door again. Silence. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. When I finally looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I exhaled, the kind of measured breath you use to steady your hands in a shop class with blades. As I turned away, my phone lit the dark from the table, a new message from the unknown number with no punctuation. "Nice watch you're wearing." For a second, it felt like the room tilted. Then it steadied. Quiet, not fear, returned. Tomorrow I would move the next piece without noise. Tonight I slipped the watch deeper into my pocket and stood at the window until the street went still enough to hear my own pulse. Paranoia speaks in questions, danger answers with silence. I chose to listen to the silence. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with the lamp off, the city dim through the blinds, the watch await in my pocket like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The message glowed on my phone until the screen dimmed itself into black. Whoever had written it knew the one object I couldn't surrender even if I wanted to. The intent didn't read as threat so much as demonstration. "I can see you." By dawn I had a list, not of enemies, but of apertures. Door. Mail slot. Webcam I never used. Building cameras. Bank lobby. Lydia's hallway. My own habits, the way I always stood near the window when I took a call. I closed what I could close without turning my home into a bunker. Then I packed one bag, nothing sentimental, and left before the first text could shape my day. The court filing landed just after 9. Lydia forwarded the docket number with a note that looked almost like reassurance if you didn't know her. They moved fast, not well. The petition read the way ornate food tastes: expensive, hollow. Undue influence, lack of capacity, family unity language ladled over thin facts. A request for a temporary order to restrict corporate actions until disputed ownership matters are resolved. I could see my mother's fingerprints in the adjectives, my stepfather in the footnotes. Performers, the both of them, fond of dressing strategy as morality. Pressure rarely arrives alone. A process server found me as I stepped out of Lydia's elevator at 10. He was young and apologetic, eyes soft with the recognition that he was a messenger inside someone else's war. Paper in my hand, I felt the familiar narrowing of options that masquerades as choice. Fight on their ground and you validate the theater. Refuse the stage and they label you evasive. The only way out was to bring my own floorboards. Lydia listened while I outlined mine. I would not freeze the visible accounts, I would isolate control quietly, then stabilize operations. Only when payroll and suppliers were shielded would I challenge their theater with my own dull instrument, precision. She studied me for a moment, then nodded once, as if adding a checkmark to a column I couldn't see. There's a board meeting this afternoon, she said. They've called it emergency advisory. Not binding, but staging matters. Go. Bring documents. Say little. The meeting took place at the headquarters Harold had built before anyone called it a headquarters, 2 floors over a warehouse and a conference room that still smelled faintly of pine from the days we stored pallets of seasonal inventory in here. The long table looked different without him at the head. My mother had dressed for victory. My stepfather had dressed to be mistaken for authority. Their council settled notebooks in front of them with the small ceremony of men who practiced winds and mirrors. I didn't sit at the head. I took the seat to the right, where Harold had set me the first time he'd allowed me in this room. The COO, Ames, arrived with a legal pad and the posture of a man who had survived more owners than he'd planned to. He glanced at me and then at Lydia, who had chosen a chair against the wall. The lawyers began. He said, for everyone's benefit, we're here to ensure stability. The word ensure is a cousin of the word control. Their presentation glittered with charts that meant nothing and paragraphs that meant less. They invoked optics, vendor confidence, public narrative, all the ways to say do it our way because we're louder. My mother did not speak. She watched me, her face the blank elegance she wore to funerals and magazine interviews. When they demanded signatures for their interim alignment plan, I asked a single question about the operational line of credit. They stumbled. I asked about the supplier terms in the Western District. They bluffed. I asked about the collateral they expected me to pledge for their unified approach. They smiled. I set the brass disc on the table, not a flourish, just weight against veneer. Ames shifted. Lydia glanced up. My mother's eyes cut to the watch outline under the lining of my jacket as if I had put a blade on the table rather than a memory. I slid the first document across, the Silent Shares Trust Deed, stamped, dated. Then the second, Harold's amendment to the corporate bylaws, executed 6 months before his death, the one that reassigned emergency voting rights to a holder identified only by a code that matched the disc. For a moment, I could hear the refrigeration unit in the warehouse downstairs tick to a slower rhythm. Lydia spoke for the first time, her tone as flat as winter light. She said, "We are not aligning today. We are acknowledging instruments previously in effect." My stepfather reached for indignation like a cufflink he couldn't quite fasten. My mother stayed very still. She had anticipated my refusal, she had not anticipated the structure of it. Performance thrives in suspense, documentation kills it. Their counsel asked to review the amendment. Lydia handed them copies and something shifted around the edges of the room, pressure looking for a new door. The first crack appeared where I expected strength. Ames cleared his throat and requested a private word. We stepped into the hallway. He looked older than he had an hour ago. He said, "Suppliers have shortened us to net 15. Someone called them this morning and said ownership's in dispute. If we don't wire by Friday, we miss spring stock. The walls always close in the same way, they follow the routes we neglect while we are counting our enemies." I had protected governance. I had not shielded the rumor mill. My victory in the conference room became immediately double-edged, the battle won at the cost of visibility that sent our vendors to the nearest exit. "Can you hold them 48 hours?" I asked. He didn't answer, but his silence felt like a bridge he was willing to be. We returned to find my mother alone at the window, her lawyers conferring with my stepfather near the door. She regarded the parking lot as if she were studying a board. Without turning, she spoke. She said, "Your grandfather was sentimental when it came to you. It made him careless." The line was calculated to cut. I let it pass through without lodging. Careless men don't embed ciphers in watchbacks. Careless men don't time amendments against predictable appetites. They pivoted to a new tactic before we adjourned. A binder appeared containing photocopies of text messages, mine to Harold during his last months, benign on their face, grocery lists, visiting schedules, notes about medications. But between them, without context, they looked choreographed, like I was managing him rather than caring for him. They had printed them without timestamps, excising the parts where my mother had been too busy to visit, where my stepfather asked for updates as if he were a supervisor at a job I ought to be grateful to hold. I could see the contours of their next petition. Narrative, shaped gently, is evidence if no one asks it questions. I didn't defend. I asked to photograph the binder for record-keeping. Lydia nodded. My mother's mouth tightened. Civility is an instrument, it bothers people when it doesn't belong to them. We ended nothing. We stood, gathered papers, made the sounds of people who had decided something. In truth, the only thing decided was that noise would escalate. As we exited, Ames caught my sleeve with a small squeeze that felt like a vote. It was the smallest kindness in a day built of angles. The text resumed as soon as I reached the sidewalk. Anonymous first, a grainy photo of my living room from street level, shot through the slit in the blinds I hadn't realized could angle both ways. Then one from my brother with performative concern, "You're making Mom look bad. People talk." Then a block of scripted messages from numbers I didn't know, each warning that I should think of the employees relying on me. Manufactured consensus. I saved them all and turned off my phone. At the bank, Erin kept her face as neutral as the marble floors. Someone had called, asking whether I appeared distraught during my last visit, whether I had suggested financial stress. She had declined to comment and documented the requests. She slid the log toward me and tapped the last entry with one finger. The caller had used my stepfather's office number, then blocked it behind a generic caller ID. The brazenness didn't surprise me. People who live by appearance assume everyone else is looking at the same mirror. I asked Erin for a quiet room. She brought me to the same interior space where I'd first opened the long box. I spread out the practical pieces of my plan and removed what tenderness could endanger it. I signed the operational trust instrument and the vendor assurance letters. I wrote 2 brief notes by hand, one to the supplier who'd carried us through a winter with a broken heater 15 years ago, one to the regional driver who had once plowed Harold's driveway at cost because he knew the store opened before dawn. Paper remembers what email performs. When I left, Erin walked me to the door in a way that said what she couldn't: "I saw you think of people first." Back at Lydia's office, a server waited with a second set of papers, not hers. The petitioners had filed a request for emergency discovery directed to me personally: phone records, emails, calendar entries, evidence of communications influencing the decedent's estate planning. Discovery isn't frightening if you live like a ledger, but it is intrusive, and intrusion is their preferred sport. Lydia skimmed it, then handed me a manila folder with a single sheet inside. Not a weapon. A mirror. Harold's handwriting again, from a year before his diagnosis, not long after he'd taught me to read vendor contracts for tripwires. If they force you to prove what is obvious, I'm sorry I didn't make it simpler. You are allowed to protect what is decent, even if they call it pride. The word steadied what anxiety had stirred. I initialed the responses we could give and blacked out what was mine alone, the personal notes that were nobody's evidence. In the middle of redacting, I realized my hands were not shaking. A small victory I didn't have time to celebrate. The confrontation I had avoided all morning became unavoidable at 4. My mother requested a brief private conversation in the lobby of the building where Harold's portrait still hung. She chose the bench beneath it like a stage. I stood because sitting next to her would have implied complicity. She reached for concern and found only gloss. She said, "This doesn't have to be ugly." Ugly is the word people use when they mean visible. I kept my voice level. I replied, then stopped performing. Her eyes flashed. There it was, the tell. She needed the audience more than the asset. She leaned closer, lowered her voice, and revealed her next card. She said, "If you insist on this, independence, we'll have to revisit your father's paternity arrangement. You're not the only one who can find old letters." The air changed temperature. It wasn't a surprise, the family mythos had always been more intricate than accurate, but there is a difference between suspecting and hearing someone weaponize what once was private pain. I did not give her the expression she wanted. I let the words traverse my body and leave by the same door. I replied, "Find whatever you like. It doesn't change who raised me." She sat back, disappointed. The threat would still do damage. Gossip always does, not because it's true, but because it gives people something to hold. But she had expected me to reopen an old wound on command. She had forgotten that dignity is a muscle. We parted with no agreement and no pretense. Outside, the sky had the flat pallor of late afternoon that never becomes evening. Ames called as I reached the curb. He had leaned on 2 vendors and bought me the 48 hours I needed. He also told me what the lawyers had not. An email blast had gone out to store managers with clarifications about the chain of command, my mother's name listed as interim executive advisor, mine omitted. Not illegal. Not binding. Poison all the same. I drove to the West District warehouse because paper couldn't tell me what ground would. The manager met me at the loading dock with the practical wariness of a man who knows freight doesn't wait for legal outcomes. We walked the aisles in silence while forklifts moved like purposeful animals between pallets. He finally spoke without looking at me. He said, "I don't care whose name is on the emails. I care who shows up." I nodded because that was all that mattered. I signed the vendor assurance letters on the metal clipboard he offered, the ink cold from the air. I authorized overtime to meet a delayed shipment with our own trucks if necessary. He didn't smile, but he folded the papers as if they were a promise he could take to his crew. Pressure loosened a notch. Night fell while I drove back. The unknown number returned with a single image, a close-up of the watch face, my jacket fabric blurred at the edges, the angle low like it had been taken from waist height. The timestamp matched the moment I'd passed a man in the lobby earlier who had held the door with exaggerated politeness. Not a stranger, then. A contractor. Building security. Or someone hired for the day. The angle told me something else too. They hadn't been inside my home when they wrote "nice watch you're wearing." They'd been close enough in public to make proximity feel like invasion. I forwarded the image to Lydia and then to the building manager with a brief note. No outrage. Just a request for footage, for a log of visitors, for the courtesy a tenant is owed. I was already moving toward a quieter apartment 2 neighborhoods away that I'd rented under the trust's name that afternoon. I had planned to wait. The image reset the clock. By the time I finished transferring the most essential files and left with my bag, the hallway was empty again. The city hummed the way it does when it believes it has seen everything and is therefore safe. I placed the watch in the inner pocket and locked the door not as a defense, but as ritual, a small way of reminding myself that exit is a choice, not a flight. I drove without the radio, the streets long and unadorned. At a red light, my phone vibrated with a call from a number I recognized but had not expected. Ames's voice was low, urgent, the way people speak before they've given themselves permission to panic. He said, "You need to see this. Someone leaked the binder to a blog. They're saying you manipulated Harold. It's spreading." I pulled to the curb and opened the link he sent. There I was, reduced to captions between screenshots, my grandfather's last months turned into a storyline for strangers to consume. Lydia called while I was still reading. She had already drafted a response, dry and unclickable, the only kind that doesn't feed a fire. She recommended I say nothing. I agreed. But silence wouldn't protect the people at the stores who were already fielding questions from customers who believed headlines over histories. I watched the comment count climb beside my name and felt nothing for myself, only for the woman at Register 3 in our North shop who had been there since I was 11 and who hated attention the way some people hate fluorescent lights. I drove to the river instead of the new apartment. The water moved with indifferent rhythm. I stood on the pedestrian bridge and let the night lift the heat from my anger. Pressure is a tool, but used incorrectly it breaks the hand that wields it. I would not break. I would not return force with spectacle. When I finally turned back, the path led me past the old ferry landing Harold had once brought me to in winter just to hear the ice crack. A memory surfaced I hadn't called for, his voice through scarf and wind, "Sometimes you let the cold come, so you know what kind of fire you'll need." My phone vibrated again. A new message from the unknown number, simple, almost conversational. "Tomorrow noon. Lawyer's office. Bring the watch or the blog gets the rest." I stood under the street lamp and felt the quiet settle into place. Tomorrow would be a confrontation on a stage not of my choosing, with a prop they didn't understand and a script I wouldn't read. I slipped the watch deeper into my pocket, the metal warm now from my body, and headed toward the dark that led, inevitably, to whatever came next. Peace didn't arrive as triumph, it came as a choice I kept making, one quiet action at a time. At noon, I walked into the paneled conference room they had chosen for theater and set my folder on the table as if it held nothing of interest. Lydia took the seat to my left without ceremony. My mother faced the door like a portrait. My stepfather's jaw worked as if he were rearranging words into the shape of power. The junior associate from their firm handled introductions because men who love microphones prefer to be announced. No one spoke about the message that had demanded the watch. They had expected coercion to be an invisible hand guiding my steps. It wasn't. The watch stayed in my jacket where it had been all morning, warm from my skin, heavy with a life that had nothing to do with them. I did not bring a prop. I brought proof. The first document Lydia slid forward was dull on purpose: vendor assurance letters executed, operational trust funded, payroll safeguarded. Ames had confirmed by text before I turned off my phone at the elevator. The second document was the amended bylaws again, this time accompanied by Harold's notarized cover memo identifying the code etched onto the brass disc. The third was a simple timeline, dates, filings, signatures, none of them dramatic, all of them fatal to the story they had been telling. Their counsel tried for momentum and found friction. Questions came, but questions require purchase. Their theory of undue influence rested on air, our facts sat on paper like stone. My mother attempted sincerity and reached lacquer. She said the word legacy and it skittered across the table like a coin no one wanted to touch. My stepfather leaned forward and called for family unity, the phrase people deploy when they mean capitulation. When their junior passed a glossy printout of the blog post across the table, Lydia did not look at it. She asked for the author's contact information, already knowing there wouldn't be any. She turned instead to the court schedule and proposed a stipulation that would preserve operations while the court disposed of their petition. She was offering them an exit from their own fire without humiliation. They should have taken it. Pride isn't a virtue, it's ballast. It sinks the least seaworthy first. I said little. When I spoke, it was only to correct a date, to point to a signature my mother had pretended not to recognize as Harold's, to decline their alignment plan with the kind of courtesy that does not leave bruises. The only moment my voice went colder was when the associate slid a manila envelope toward me with a faint smile that telegraphed, "We know something you don't." Inside were old photographs, copied from albums that had never left my mother's house, posed moments from my childhood annotated in the margins with suggestions of distance between Harold and me, as if intimacy could be erased by sepia. I didn't look up. I simply stacked their pages beneath our filings, then placed a plain flash drive on the table. Inside it was what they hadn't anticipated I would still have: short, ordinary videos Harold and I recorded the last month. He was lucid of him explaining inventory procedures to me the way he always had, precise, autonomous, entirely himself. He had saved them to the cloud under a folder named for a supplier discount we joked about for years. He looked into the camera once and said, in the way he spoke when he wanted misunderstood people to feel steadier, You take care of what you've built." He was not confused. He was the same man who had built the store that paid for their summers. We did not play the videos in the room. We didn't need spectacle. Lydia narrated the authentication process and the chain of custody. Their counsel said nothing useful. After that, there was nowhere for the conversation to go but down. We adjourned with a temporary standstill order drafted on our terms, preserving operations, freezing any advisory communications they might try to seed in the stores, and setting a hearing date soon enough that rumor wouldn't have time to grow new roots. Out in the hallway, my mother reached out and touched my sleeve, a light press of her fingers that read less as affection than as measurement. I let her hand fall without flinching. Outside, the day had softened into a sky the color of paper. Wind moved along the river, unbothered by our documents and winds and injuries. I walked to the water and let the silence do what it always does, make space for the useful questions. The days that followed were work, not war. The blog post burned fast and then cooled when it met the damp towel of fact. Lydia filed a measured response, uninteresting enough that it refused to feed anyone's appetite. The store managers received clear memos that were not weapons, just schedules and shipment statuses, plus my direct number with the instruction to call if anything felt unstable. I spent a morning answering those calls at a metal desk in the West District office, not as a savior, just as someone who knew the difference between a supply chain and a storyline. Ames and I mapped cash flow for 6 weeks. We gave small vendors guarantees first, the ones for whom a missed payment meant the rent. We pushed back gently against bigger suppliers who live by late fees. We rotated stock without theatrics and scheduled overtime where it would spare the least tired people, not just the most visible. Under fluorescent lights, the choices looked unremarkable. They were the hinge of the whole thing. At home, I moved deliberately through rooms I was no longer interested in defending. The new apartment held nothing ornate, the floors were old wood with honest scuffs. I unpacked the cedar box and placed Harold's letters in a drawer where I would not mistake them for fresh tasks. The watch I did not display. I set it in a small dish on the dresser where I put my keys at night, not relic, not weapon, simply a thing that had done its job. My mother tried new angles that were also old ones in different clothing. 2 voicemails arrived within an hour of each other, one apologetic without apology, one threatening without content. I archived both. A week later, she sent flowers to my office with a card that read, "Let's start over." The bouquet smelled like sugar and perfume and a decade of giving her the first and last word. I wrote a note that said, "We can begin again, but not where we left off," and did not send it. I didn't need to tell her anything for it to be true. When the hearing came, it was brief. The judge was a woman who had watched enough families implode to know what not to believe. She read without frowning, asked 2 questions whose answers were waiting in our exhibits, and then denied the injunction with a sentence that sounded like common sense. In the hallway afterward, my stepfather brushed past me hard enough to bruise my shoulder. I did not step aside. My mother avoided my eyes, her mouth pinched into a line that might have been shock or an attempt not to show the camera on someone's phone the shape of her loss. We signed 3 more papers and left. I could have pursued sanctions or a counterclaim for the defamation campaign. The letters were drafted and waiting should I ask. I didn't. There is a point at which punishment becomes a second career. I had work to do that paid in steadier currency. The external quiet arrived first. Emails went back to being about screws and shelving and which store needed a new employee chair before someone's back gave out. The blog forgot me and remembered a new scandal. The unknown number went silent after security released footage of a temp contractor photographing tenants in the lobby and the property manager called the police. The contractor's agency settled privately for the breach. I felt nothing like victory, I felt the relief of a door properly latched. Inside, quiet came slower, and I took it seriously. I started walking again before sunrise, the city softer at that hour, the river a slate line that made my thoughts behave. I made coffee without checking my phone. I called Erin at the bank once, not for business, just to thank her for the plain competence that had anchored a day when competence was rare. She sounded surprised and then sounded like a person whose work had been seen. That was all I wanted lately, to see what holds. I began to write, not for court or counsel, but for myself, fragments of days with Harold at the store, each a small memory unmarred by strategy. The morning he made me count the washers in a jar to prove the number on the label was wrong by only 4, but that 4 would matter eventually. The winter he sent me home early to study because he said no business should be built on a granddaughter's fatigue. The summer he accused the air conditioner of malingering and then laughed at himself for humanizing machines. I wrote until the air in my chest changed pressure. The past loosened its hold when I gave it a place to sit. My mother did not call for a month. When she finally did, it was to say that she and my stepfather were taking time away to recenter, phrases that sounded expensive and temporary. Her voice trembled once, a burr in a silk thread. I didn't trust it. I didn't dismiss it. Some wounds don't make people better, they make them quiet for a while. I have stopped confusing quiet with growth. I met Ames and the district managers for lunch in the break room of the downtown store, not to celebrate, just to listen. Someone had brought a cake that said thank you, Harold, and blue icing that stained everyone's tongues and made their sentences look like they had been spoken in another climate. It made me unexpectedly happy. We told small stories that didn't require anyone's defense. The older cashier from Register 3 admitted she had almost quit when the headlines hit but decided she'd been through worse gossip in churches and stayed to count back exact change to people who needed exactness. That felt like a benediction. With Lydia's help, I set up a fund in Harold's name that paid for community college tuition for employees' children who wanted something practical: HVAC certification, nursing degrees, accounting. We wrote the criteria in plain English and refused to require essays about overcoming adversity. Not every achievement needs a narrative arc to be worthy. When the first acceptance letters arrived, I read them at my kitchen table and cried without shame because it was not grief, it was heat returning to fingers after too long outside. At night, I walked the aisles of the main store after closing, the lights humming, the metal shelves reflecting white. I ran my hand along the edge where Harold used to knock his knuckles twice like a punctuation. In the small ladder aisle, a boy asked his father how to know if a ladder is safe, and the father answered without hesitation, "You check the feet and you don't rush." I stood between paint and plumbing and thought that this was the only legacy worth keeping, not a surname, not a stock class, but practices that continue without you because they make sense. When the watch stopped one morning, a small thing, the second hand caught on the edge of a minute, I didn't take it as a sign. I wound it, then didn't. I set it back in the dish and let it rest. Objects carry us forward until we can carry ourselves. I had crossed that line without noticing. In the end, I offered my family nothing and something. The nothing was access. The something was a letter I wrote and sent once, unreturned, a boundary in ink that explained what I would no longer give and what I was still willing to hold open, holidays where no one discussed money, brief visits where history was not a weapon, silence that wasn't punishment but rest. The letter did not ask for apology. It did not promise reconciliation. It said, "I hope we do not waste what time remains on proving old stories true. I don't believe in neat justice. I don't believe in revenge that blooms without poisoning the ground. What I believe now is simpler: you take care of what you've built. You take care of people who keep it standing when storms arrive. You take care of yourself as if you were also someone's legacy. Some days, that looks like a court order. Some days, it looks like a thank you note. Most days, it looks like showing up, unlocking the door, and greeting the first person in line by their name." The last time I closed the store alone, the light outside was the pale gold of a season changing. I locked the deadbolt, pressed my palm against the door's cool glass, and saw my reflection, older in a useful way, smaller in a way that felt like humility rather than diminishment. I didn't carry the watch. I didn't need to. The river was quiet as I walked home, and for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel like a test. It felt like a room with the windows open. It felt like breath I didn't have to measure. It felt, finally, like mine. What would you have protected first, the business that fed so many lives, or the urge to answer harm with a sharper harm? If you had to choose between winning loudly and living rightly, where would you draw your line? If these are the kinds of stories that make you think about quiet strength, earned boundaries, and consequences that feel like balance, subscribe and be part of this community where we take our time with hard truths.